Welcome to Module 4 and welcome to Gesture Drawing Foundations. In this module, we're going to look at what gesture is, the kinds of gestures, the kinds of ways we want to see gestures in gesture drawing, and really just understand what is gesture. What is gesture? So a lot of the time when you think about gesture drawing, you probably have this idea in your mind that people are doing kind of life drawings, maybe life drawings from photos or life drawings from real models. But the truth really is that those artists are attempting to try to capture the essence or the core of the pose. And that really is what gesture drawing is, capturing the core or the essence of the figure, of the form. But more importantly, once you understand how to capture it and how to see it, that you will then be able to utilize this knowledge to give your characters feeling and emotion and life. Because this course obviously isn't a figure drawing course, it's a character drawing course. And characters are very much full of personality, full of life. They can relate to one another, they can relate to the viewer, and people just feel inspired and motivated, and they believe in this sort of life that you're putting into the page. So gesture is very, very, very important. A good way to think about gesture sort of at its core is that it really is the soul, the point, the entire kind of overall message or structure of a pose or of a character's sort of emotions in a sense. It's the core, it's kind of the foundation of it. And you'll hear me using different words like this, core and essence and directional flow and things like that when we talk about gesture. So gesture is very, very important. And gesture falls into the shape category. So it's very much falling into a kind of compositional category. We're looking at it in terms of a strictly drawing type of sense. It would fall into shape. It's got everything to do with how we think about dynamic shapes, how we structure the foundations or the shape composition of the pose and things like that. So it's important to remember that it falls into shape. So the way we're going to be learning about gesture is instead of just having this kind of vague idea where we're going to be drawing figure drawings or photos, we're going to learn gesture in four ways, right? And the first way is directional flow shapes. Now, as we've learned, we know that sort of static shapes, they don't seem to have any directionality, but when we bend them, we can give them a sense of directionality. So the first way we'll be learning about gestures is by doing directional flow gestures. And I'll do an example over here so that we can get a sense of what that's going to be like. So directional flow gestures would be just focusing really on flat shapes and not thinking too much about forms and just feeling out the gestures. So I'll just do something very basic here. And you may be recognizing some of these general, some of this general flow from us doing the form module in module 3. So this would be directional flow shapes. Let's call it directional flow shapes. Or really just shape gestures. So we're not thinking about form. And this is really important that we grasp this, that we're understanding that we're grabbing this type of silhouette that's just very flat, but still very readable types of shapes and directional flow shapes, right? And then we'll be doing dynamic form gestures. So we'll kind of take our directional flow shape gestures here, and we will then add form onto them, which we hopefully know how to do. And I'm going to actually put this in a different color, and we'll start building those basic forms on top of the gestures and kind of imagining all of our structures. Put some center lines there so that we can get that sense that the forms are based on the directional flow, the energy kind of flow gestures, right? Directional energy and the directional movement, kinetic energy through the forms. So then here we have form-based gesture. And then we'll be doing anatomical gestures, where we're going to combine our shape and our form knowledge, and we're hopefully going to then use our anatomical knowledge that we learned from the reference material to build on top of what we have here I'm just going to lighten this a little bit. And we'll then start utilizing the reference and building anatomy on top of these structures. Obviously, I'm doing this out of my head here, but I'm going to imply some anatomical forms here. The pecs and the pelvis. Okay. So we want to grasp gestures from a fundamental perspective first, before we start getting into doing crazy hardcore life drawings where, you know, if you had to just start out with that without any decent fundamental knowledge, you would probably not be very successful for a long time, and you'd waste a lot of time trying to figure out why you weren't being very successful. So this would be our anatomical gestures, where we're looking at references and drawing out those gestures, and we will certainly get into that in the next few lessons. And then last but not least, we will then do life gestures, right? Life gesture drawing. You might be like, well, what the heck is that? Well, once we know the shape and the form, and we have a good understanding of the anatomy of the gestures, and we've also been doing our daily anatomy studies, then we can actually move into life-based gestures, where we're looking at people and we're doing that typical thing maybe where you sit at the coffee shop and you're looking at people walk by and you're trying to capture the entire gesture of the person as quickly as possible. So for example, a typical life-based gesture might be something like this, and it's not really, I'm not doing some crazy drawing here, but let's see, I'm going to draw something like this and maybe something like that, and quickly just doing almost a scribble if you wish, but just trying to get the gesture. And we have an old lady with a stick, or an old man with a stick, or what have you. And these are sort of life-based gestures or life gestures where we're trying to quickly capture overall forms of things. For example, perhaps a man waiting at a bus stop might look something like this. Maybe he's got a sling bag on him. He's quite a broad man. He's wearing a hat. So these are really the life gestures. So we want to think of gestures in these categories. So let's just take a look at them one more time. We have our shape-based gestures, which are what we're going to be learning first, then form, then anatomical gestures, and then we're going to look at life gestures. And all of this gesture work is done from life. We want to learn gesture from life so that when we're drawing imaginatively, we have strong foundations in how to capture those movements and the energetic feeling and the dynamic flow of the human forms in those characters. And even more so, once again reiterating that we want to then be able to imbue how the character's feeling, what the character is thinking, and then utilize what we know of gesture to better communicate these aspects of our characters, who our characters are, how they're feeling, what they're doing, what they're anticipating, and so on and so forth. Last but not least, and this is a very important point that I want you to remember throughout your drawing career, hopefully for the rest of your life, but especially while we're doing this module. And it's really one of the main fundamental points of gesture drawing, is that you need to exaggerate the gesture, right? Exaggerate the gesture. And the reason you need to exaggerate it, particularly just the basic gesture of the form, is when you're doing a drawing and you're kind of getting your dynamic forms going and you're doing like a cool, you know, you're trying to get all these kind of nice dynamism happening in the piece and so on. If you don't tilt things enough, twist things enough, do adequate rotations and push the actual pose, push the pose and really try and make it as exaggerated as possible, not overly exaggerated, but fairly exaggerated. What happens is when we get to the cleanup stage, where we're now putting in some clean lines and we're detailing and we're drawing the face and we're drawing the anatomy in and the clothes and the hair, what happens is if the gesture is not exaggerated enough underneath, then when you start adding the details and adding the anatomy and the clothes and the accessories and all the other elements to the character, it can tend to kill the gesture a little bit. So basically adding details and adding these elements kills or really tones down the initial gesture. That's why it's important that we need to exaggerate the gesture a little bit. So that we are compensating for that sort of toning down effect that adding detail can have to a character drawing. Okay, so remember, exaggerate the gesture, and you will see, maybe even if you've exaggerated a little too much, that when you do start adding the details tend to really tone the gesture down quite a bit. So very important point, exaggerate the gesture. Let's not forget that. All right, that's the end of the intro to the module. Let's get into it. Let's now take a look at the importance of understanding opposing curves and directional flow. So in terms of directional flow, it really goes back to the things I've been saying about static shapes versus shapes that have directionality to them. And we can achieve that by kind of bending the edges and the sides of things to give a general directionality to the shape. Right, so this shape really, if you ask someone what direction it's moving in, it's not really moving in any particular direction. And you might say to someone, hey, what direction do you think this is moving? And they'll probably say it's moving in this particular direction. And the same applies to form, where we want to avoid using non-directional forms or forms that lack kind of energy. I'll draw through on this cube just for the sake of a better understanding. And this is very static. It's not really moving anywhere. Although you could definitely argue that this side, in terms of a shape, is a directional shape for sure, right? Directional shape's moving there, but the overall form is very static. And so what we want to do then as well is add directionality to the forms, kind of bending our forms in particular ways and having the form feel more directional, right? Like it has more energy to it. Things are being bent and twisted and there's some kind of movement happening in the form. All right, so static shapes and forms we don't want, and dynamic shapes and forms we do want, right? And this applies both into our compositional thinking when we think about shapes, and of course into our form thinking when we're thinking about forms and the three-dimensionality of the things that we are creating and things that we are drawing. All right, but now adding on to this knowledge, right, so that we know dynamic is good. Right, dynamic is good, but how do we apply this dynamism to the human form? And this particular theory has different names, although I don't think it's ever been called the name that I tend to call it, or explained particularly in the way I'm going to explain it to you. But nevertheless, I like to think of this as opposing curves. Okay, opposing curves. And really the rule is that where one thing curves one way, the next thing will curve the next. And you've seen this when we've done our form-based, when we've done our, when we've done our forms, our dynamic forms, we will make the top of the arm bend one way, and then we'll bend the forearm another way. And really, another name for this is rhythm or flow is another name as well. And this is introducing this rhythm or flow or opposing curves, this directionality into a character or any kind of living object. And you can also obviously also put it into non-living objects as well, but specifically in terms of characters, we want to think about this in terms of the form and in terms of the anatomy. And so opposing curves theory really is that we don't ever want to have, first of all, some curves that kind of repeat like this, because then there's kind of there's really no energy flow through this. It's kind of stops here, and then the energy just has to then start again, and it's like a pause in the energy flow. So it's kind of like boom, pause, and then it has to start again, boom, and it loses its flow, right? And you can see the difference when we have something like this. The energy just kind of keeps going, right, when we have opposing curves happening. In addition, when we're doing opposing curves, we want to make sure that the curves don't ever oppose in a parallel way. So for example, here I have two paralleling curves. All right, and yes, they're certainly in opposing curves fashion, but hopefully you can see that the fact that the lines are parallel means that the shapes are no longer dynamic, and so that there is no directionality in the shapes, even though we're using opposing curves theory. Really what we want to do is we want to take dynamic shape and form theory and add it to opposing curves theory, and therefore get ourselves a great system for drawing natural looking forms, natural looking gestures, natural looking characters that look alive, that look like they're filled with energy that look like they're just paused in time, but usually when we're not pausing them in a single image, they're walking around and they're thinking and they're talking and they're living their lives, right? So opposing curves theory, once again, really is just that something curves the one way, you then curve it another way. And you may be saying, hey, I've heard of something called straight to curve, or I've heard of something like curve against straight. And that is in fact a different theory that isn't got to do with gesture, has got to do more with avoiding parallels or creating basically non-parallel shapes, which we will talk about later in the course. So don't worry about that for now. Opposing curves, really, if something curves one way, the next piece of it should curve the other way. Now when we get to bringing these theories right into character drawing, I've got a stock photo here of a little baseball player, and we're going to draw over him so that you can kind of see how these opposing curves work, as well as how the dynamic shape works, both in the shape of his gesture and the forms of his gesture. Okay, so let's get right into it. And first of all, we can just start by defining his head, because that's always a great starting point with characters. Just get the head shape in there. And we want to consider the back of the head as one of our first curves, right? So it's curving that way. That means we can't see his neck here, but that would mean that his neck would then have to curve the other way, right? So it does that. And then we come into his back shape. And so we will imagine his whole torso, and I'm keeping it 2D for now, bending that way, which would mean that as we come through his stomach and down into his pelvis, right, so we've curved this way. Let's actually do that in blue. The shape, the dynamic shape, will then naturally kind of curve the opposite direction, right? So we can see this happening here. That curves down, and then this curves inwards. Similarly on the front, it curves down, and then this one curves outwards. All right. And then we get to the legs, and they are their whole own shapes. So you kind of, I know it can be confusing when you're trying to think about it in terms of the pelvis. They really are their own shapes. The front of the leg would curve down like this. So that curves in that direction. And then the back of the leg would have to oppose. So it would make a dynamic shape in that direction. Right. And similarly for the other leg. It curves like that. And then this one curves in the opposite way. You can see as well that I'm not sticking exactly to the anatomy here. And that's a very key point, especially when we go and actually do our practical gesture drawing demos and exercises, that we are not trying to capture the anatomy here, right? When we're talking about gesture, until we get to anatomical gestures, when we're talking about the kind of the core or the soul of gesture, we're just trying to capture the core, right? The core directional forces moving through the form and trying to grasp them so that when we're left with just the gesture, we can still tell what's going on, even though there's no detailing or anatomy or anything. We can say, okay, this kid is running, or this person is running, or what have you. Let's do the arms. The arms work in a similar way. And just as a side note, the way I tend to figure out the arms, even when I'm drawing, is I draw the forearms directionality first. So here I would say this forearm is doing that. It has that kind of directional shape. And this back one's kind of hard to read, but I would say it's doing that. And because I know the direction of the one curve, so this guy's curving that way, right? I know that the next curve going into the rear arm needs to be an opposing curve. So I can't ever have curve and then say, oh, well, there's my arm shape. That would be weird, and it wouldn't make sense in terms of the directionality. Because we know opposing curve says needs to oppose, so the correct shape would be this and then that, and it looks way more correct. So here we then take the curve the opposite direction and draw in that directional shape. All right. And then similarly here, if it's curving that way there, then it's curving this way here. All right. And so we can then see the curves oppose. this would then curve that way, that shape curves over, and then the opposing curve comes down on the other side. Let's take the reference image away, and you can see we got a good feeling. We haven't copied anatomy, we haven't thought too crazy about forms and details and so on and so forth. We're just thinking about the gesture and the gestural shapes. This is the first key and most important foundational thing that we need to be aware of when we are trying to learn to do gesture drawings. So we want to capture the opposing curves in the gestures. And when we fully understand this, right, and you will do many exercises to get it into your system, then we can start adding on top of this. And by no means, let me just add, by no means is this a particular drawing workflow. It may be a workflow for you, but as we know from module 3, we want to do shape and form at the same time. So we want to really draw forms and then modify the forms based on our shape theory. But if you wish to work in this in a workflow type of way where you say to yourself, okay, I want to do shape gestures first, we're just using directional shapes, then I want to build forms on top, then I want to put details on top of the forms, you can do that as well if it's better for you to understand that. Nevertheless, when we understand this in terms of gesture studies, we want to grasp this first, grasp the 2D first, right? Or the 2D or the directional flow shapes, right? Let's call them DF shapes. And then we want to move on to adding directional flow forms or dynamic forms. So I'm really using these terms interchangeably. Move into 3D directional form, dynamic forms, right? So we can then come here to what we've done here and then start imagining those cylinders that we want to have going to help us define the forms and help us really grasp drawing in 3D, and then use what we know of the shapes, the basic shapes that we've been learning, the basic forms, mind you, we've been learning for these elements, the pelvis and the chest and so on and so forth, to really get these forms in there, all right, and putting in our center lines and so on. And you can see here where I'm just really adding those forms over the dynamic shapes, and it's giving me a great sense of motion and movement and life. Something that, you know, apart from utilizing these theories and having this understanding, I wouldn't be able to do. I wouldn't be able to draw this because my brain, and generally speaking, most beginner brains, you know, in terms of art, thinks, hey, let me draw anatomy, right? Let me draw anatomy. But characters are so much more than anatomy. And we really want to grasp that and move past that so that we can really become experts at understanding how people move and how people move based on how they feel and how they're and who they are as people and so on. But we'll get into this deeper stuff later. Nevertheless, what we want to understand really, I'm going to just reiterate again, so we want to have our directional shapes. We want to make sure the shapes and forms that we use are directional. And then we want to say to ourselves, okay, in forms, particularly characters, in the instance of this course, in characters, we want to make sure that the curves oppose, or the dynamic shapes curves oppose each other, right? So we have an opposing curve. So the curves that way, it curves out, and the next one will then curve in. And as an addition, and I had mentioned this in module 3, we want to realize that this happens even as we go onto a micro level. So it happens on the hand. So if we were just doing a basic hand shape here for his hand out here, I'm just going to draw in a hand that's, you know, I'm just going to add my own hand in here. If the curve is going out like that, that means the palm of the hand would then come out like that, and then the fingers would oppose like that, right? In a macro sense, if we just divided the hand into two separate elements, we'd have this part curving up like that, and then the fingers curving down, because we still want to have the opposing curves theory in there, because it just makes sense and it works and it's wonderful. And then similarly, you can go even more macro. So here we have the palm and the fingers, but if we zoom in on the actual fingers, and I think that we did cover this in module 3, the fingers themselves and their joints will be made up of opposing curve shapes, where we have, you know, one piece and then the joint, and then another piece and then the joint, and then another piece that would be the tip, right? The finger, because the fingers have 3 joints. And the directional flow through the fingers opposes, right? And you will notice immediately when you start implementing this theory into your work that immediately your characters will start seeming more natural, more loose, more professional. No matter what level you're at, when you apply it, suddenly something seems more informed about your work, more natural, and things start seeming more alive. And that's exactly how I want to, or where I want to take you guys, get us to that point. So here I'm just going to kind of do a quick detailing as if I were drawing an actual finger over here, and you can see it's a living type of finger, right? Even with very basic anatomy there, it's living because of this directional flow shapes, and using the opposing curves theory, where we want to oppose each of the curves. All right, I'm sure that that's solidified. Let's move on to the next lesson. Let's now talk about lines of action, right? What are lines of action? You may or may not have heard of what lines of action are. We're going to look at it, we're going to dissect it. And I'm going to use this baseball kid photo again, just to illustrate the point here. So really, you get a primary line of action and a secondary line of action in your characters, or secondary lines of action, mind you. So in this particular piece, when I look at this character, I'll mark out his head, and then I'll determine for myself, based on what I see, where the primary line of action is. And the primary line of action is the line that really describes and kind of summarizes the overall movement of that particular pose, right? So the primary line of action is just the line that shows that overall movement, that overall directional movement. And the line of action generally takes shape as some kind of C curve. So it could be very kind of short C curves or really bent C curves, or some kind of S curves where you have these types of shapes happening, kind of little ones and big ones or something like that. And they really summarize and kind of categorize into the overarching story really of the total movement of the entire body, right? So the line of action really, it shows the line of action in the form, right? The line of action in the form. It doesn't have any particularly clear directionality to it, other than in this instance kind of shows his weighting kind of moving there, but really it's just the line of action running from the head through the form. Not to be confused with the center line, not to be confused with the spinal line, right? The line of action is a gestural line. It doesn't really exist per se, but it's something that we're using, we want to see in the form of the general directional movement of the form. And this main line that runs through the form is the primary line of action, right? The primary line of action. Consequently, secondary lines of action are lines that come from the primary line of action and flow from it in a very natural way. If they aren't flowing from it, then the secondary line of action aren't good. Now, usually in real people, the secondary line of action generally always makes sense unless something terrible has happened to the person where their joints are all out of whack. And but nevertheless, and let's draw in some secondary lines of action here, which really follow the opposing curves theory. Right, so here we have it curving over and then under, and then this arm does the same thing, right? So the secondary lines of action kind of flow from the main line of action. And this leg here, the nearest leg, really follows in step with the primary line of action. And so these blue lines represent the secondary lines of action, which really, I've overcomplicated them here a little bit, but really they show the overall summary of the movement in the limbs, right? The limbs and the head and legs. So we can also simplify them more if you're not in an opposing curves mindset, or you really want to just draw it out quickly. And we would just do these kind of simple curves just to show the secondary line of action in a much more simple way there with the purple lines. But since we know opposing curves theory, we might as well just use it to help us build those secondary lines of action. So in essence, that's what line of action is. The primary line of action, definitely the most important, but really it's the overall movement and the overall gestural movement and kind of flow of the entire body, right? That is what the primary line of action represents. And then the secondary line of action is there to help us add in flow, in step, in opposing curves, in a dynamic flow, the limbs, the arms, the legs, as well as the head, as they flow out from that primary line of action flow. And why do we learn this? Because this is the very best way to start off capturing the gesture of a reference or of a real person very quickly when we're trying to learn more about the forms. We will start with the line of action. Nevertheless, we'll get to those demos. Let's move on to the next lesson. we now understand that the line of action really represents the overall movement of the body, right? So in this instance of this model that we have here, we'll draw in a circle for her head, some kind of ellipse for her head, and we'll define the line of action. And that's great. But there are two other important lines that we want to know about: the spinal line as well as the center lines, and what their purposes are. So the spinal line, as its name implies, is us imagining the position of the spine. Fortunately, it works very much in an opposing curves fashion. As the neck, as the vertebrae of the spine comes down from the neck area, it opposes out, it bends around the back, it goes in at the stomach section, and then around down the pelvis. And this would be the spinal line. And the spinal line is a great tool for helping us position anatomy and body elements when we're doing complex or even simple poses. It's a really good measuring stick as well that we can measure our proportions against. Where are we ending the line? How are the curves working? Where do we need to bend the skin around the forms when we've built the forms? And it's also a great tool in constructing your drawings, because if you get the spinal line in and you're thinking about the spinal line, it helps you better position where you want to put the forms on top of that spinal line so that it makes sense in 3 dimensions. So that is the spinal line. And it really is a great tool. Let's put the line of action here. Last but not least, we then have the center lines, also known as the axial line. And the center line really is a line that we use for measuring when we've got the forms down. So there's the center line of the face, there's the center line of the neck, and I'll draw in a form here for the chest. And that's the center line for the chest. And here's the stomach. Let's draw it as a sphere. There's the center line of the stomach area, and we've got our pelvis shape, and there's the center line for our pelvis shape. And the center line, or the axial line, let's call it center axial, its purpose is to help us measure, right? Help us to know that we're placing facial features in a logical way, that they read as balanced on the face. And it's a measuring tool, really. Helps us to say, okay, this is the center of the form, and so therefore if I put a button here, I need to put a button here, because that is a logical kind of measurement based off the center line positioning. And you can use center lines and implement them wherever you feel that you need them. Especially good for placing elements on clothing and figuring out just the general measurements of the forms, right? The center line. Just want to highlight the center line here for us as well. All right, so the center line's used for measurement, right? And I would advise definitely when you're doing your construction drawings, use them where you need them. It's just another tool in your toolbox to help you draw well and help you draw effectively. So these are the 3 lines we want to know, but particularly we want to talk about the spinal line, the center or axial line, and just their various purposes. And that's the end of this lesson. Let's move on. In this lesson, we're going to look at vertical and horizontal axes, why they're important for us, how to use them in gesture drawing, as well as how we're going to use them in our normal drawing when we're busy drawing characters out of our imaginations. So the first thing is we want to know what these are, right? What is a vertical axis? What is a horizontal axis? And I've got these 3 example images here to illustrate this point. The first thing we're going to look at is the horizontal axis of this girl on the left. We're going to use her eye line to define the kind of tilt, if you will, the vertical or horizontal tilt, in this case horizontal tilt of her head. And we can use her shoulder line to determine the horizontal tilt of her shoulders and her chest area. And then we can estimate where her pelvic line is to assume the horizontal tilt of her pelvis. And then for the legs, we can then use the knees, which is something like that. So we basically just link the knees together. And when you look at these lines and you recognize that they are not parallel, that is a very good thing. We want to avoid parallels in our horizontal and vertical tilts, right? Let's look at the next image's horizontal tilts. There's a line through her eyes and her shoulder line and her pelvic line. Once again, no parallels. Everything is at some kind of angle. And then the last image, her eye line, her shoulder line. We'll have to assume her pelvis is something like that, and her knee line. And once again, no parallels. And this is very, very key in character drawing to achieving dynamic looking character posing, right? Or dynamic character poses. For gesture drawing, particularly, the horizontal tilts are useful for helping us quickly grasp the pose of the reference material we're looking at. So that's the primary reason we're learning this now, but we will touch on this again when we get to character composition. Nevertheless, let's look at the vertical tilts in these forms. Here we can see her head tilting slightly forward and her torso sort of tilting at that angle, her pelvis tilting down, and then her legs each individually tilting at different angles. We don't really need to do the arms that much. Similarly here, her head tilts at this angle vertically. Her chest is kind of tilting at the same angle, so if this were a drawing, we might want to modify that a little bit, tilt the head forward vertically or back vertically a little bit, just so that there isn't a parallel. And then her pelvis tilting at a different angle, which is great, right? We don't want those parallels. This sample image here for her head, her chest is tilting this way, her pelvis is likely tilting at that angle, and then her legs are tilting both at different angles. And so this once again goes back to our rule as well, our rule in our thinking about parallels and how parallels are something we want to avoid. Even in the tilts, we want to avoid parallels. But the great thing is when you're talking about horizontal vertical tilts or horizontal and vertical axes, this really helps us get dynamism in our posing. All right, so let's close these examples down. Let's take a quick look at what an image looks like when we add it in and when we leave it out. So I'm going to do a just a very quick form drawing here. We're going to just add in some elements. And I'm just doing very shorthand forms here to get this in. I say shorthand because I'm not drawing all the way through. I'm more imagining the drawing through in my mind of the actual shape of these forms. Let's change that one a little bit. Let's do this instead. Keep it rough, keep it loose. All right, not exactly proportionate, but it'll serve our purposes for this demo. All right, so here we have a drawing that is pretty much tiltless. It's tiltless in all of its vertical and horizontal major regions. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use the selection tool, the digital selection tool in Photoshop, to manually tilt these and introduce some dynamism into the pose. So I'm tilting the head forward there. I'm going to select the shoulders and the arms as one body here. Tilt the shoulders this way. All right. And I think we'll leave the legs on their own different positionings. And we'll just tilt the pelvis down like that. And just for the sake of being correct, we want to now adjust the position of the legs just a little bit based on the new angle of the pelvis, right? So we'll grab this one and we will adjust that. I think in this instance we want to put it just a little bit higher. All right. And now what we have is a character that is significantly more dynamic than the first one, because the first one has these very parallel horizontal axes and also very parallel vertical axes. Like everything's very, very parallel and boring. And, you know, somewhere in the viewer's subconscious, they're recognizing this and it's not exciting them. There's no asymmetry to it. It's very predictable. Yet in this one, we have very nice opposing horizontal and verticals. And so we've easily achieved a level of dynamism. I suppose these two are actually very similar, the legs, but still a bit different. I guess these are a little bit different now that I look at it. But nevertheless, we've now achieved significant levels of dynamism just by adjusting the horizontal and vertical tilts, or horizontal and vertical axes, whichever you prefer. I prefer tilts personally. Right, and this gives us dynamism. Now, for the purposes of gesture drawing, when we are assessing and looking at the reference material, when we get into it, and there will be demos of this coming up, we will have a reference image on the left, and we'll be wanting to capture that gesture on the right. And looking at the reference material's horizontal tilts particularly, and adding in those horizontal lines while we're trying to grasp the gesture, helps us quickly get the proportions and quickly find out the right locations for elements as we're drawing them out. And you'll see that's great. But for the purposes of drawing in general, we will revisit this topic and explain how it's absolutely critical to have your horizontal and your vertical tilts happening in the forms to bring dynamism to the pose and a natural look, and have the characters seem like they're actually trying to balance themselves and as if they were alive and you were capturing them in a moment of time. As a last note on this lesson, the Italian word for this sort of act of balancing in a way is called contrapposto, which means counterpose. And effectively, it's describing when we rest our weight on one side of our bodies. Get a layer going here. Take this character over here, for example. Because he's leaning back over here, he's resting his weight on his right leg, which pushes his pelvis up. All right, and his torso is now coming slightly down, which causes the skin area here on this side to kind of stretch because the pelvis is tilting down here and the torso is tilting up. And so what you have is the start of something that we will go into later as well, called squash and stretch, in a sense, where this section, and let's get a different color here, is squashing, and this section here is stretching out. Now, squash and stretch is used in many different instances, but in this instance, this is what's happening, where when this pivot point is moved, one side of the body stretches and the other side of the body squashes, and it's a very interesting thing to note. However, we don't need to learn contrapposto necessarily in that way, although it is good to understand how the body is balancing itself and where the weight is going. But what's better for us is to simply remember, when we're drawing our characters, let us make sure we are having this variance and making sure that we do not have parallels in our horizontal or our vertical axes. We really want to avoid parallels in art in general, unless we're doing something that is more blueprinty, obviously. All right. That's the end of this lesson. Let's move on. All right, let's get started now drawing out the dynamic shape gesture of this particular model over here. And the best place to start is to always start with the head. We'll just kind of put an ellipse in there to get the head shape in. Nothing more complex than that. We're keeping things very energy, directional flow focused. And then establishing the line of action, right? Establishing the primary line of action. So in this character, it's something like that, right? Establishing the primary line of action. And then what we can do to further help us even more is establish the eye line, the shoulder line, it's about here, the pelvic line, and the knee line. We don't really want to do that because we don't have a good guide on the line of action here for that. But that's okay, we'll get those in, no problem. So now we can see we've used horizontal tilts to help us determine these angles, which is great. It's a good way to help us measure where we should then put our dynamic shapes, as well as using our opposing curves on those dynamic shapes. So now we have the head in, the primary action line, and the horizontal tilts that we've marked out. We can then proceed to draw in those very basic shapes. So I'm going to start with the arm here. And I always find drawing the forearm works best for me. So this would be this type of shape. And as I do this, I want to reiterate, this is really not about anatomical drawing, right? We're grabbing the energy flow of the gesture. That's what you want to be thinking about. We're grabbing the energy flow of the gesture and using these directional shapes to help us get this gesture to read well. So there I'm using that there, and I will oppose that as we come down here. for that arm. As for the hands and the feet, usually you can just indicate them to some extent here. It's not very important to spend too much time trying to get little details on the hands and things like that, especially when you're drawing at this scale. I wouldn't even worry necessarily about the neck that much. I'm just going to put in an opposing curve there. Following my line of action, I'm going to determine what the directional flow is of her chest area. Stomach area is something like that. And then her pelvis sort of here, like that. Poses, opposes, opposes, just checking myself. And then I'm going to draw in the legs. Let's start with the front leg here. Shouldn't say the legs. I should say rather that I'm going to draw in the directional shape, the directional flow, the energy flow of the legs. All right. And I'm going to oppose that. And look at how rough I'm being. You know, this is not supposed to be pretty beautiful art. And I want you to feel the exact same way about it. We're here to learn. We're busy grabbing the energy flow out of the pose. And once we've grasped this, we can then move on to more advanced topics. So my scaling is a little bit off, but it's not the end of the world. The bulk of it is that the bulk of the gesture has been grabbed. The pose has been grabbed. Could you ask maybe a 5 or a 6-year-old, hey, could you copy the pose of this drawing of mine? They probably could, because they can see the gesture and they understand the gesture. And so this is what we want to be doing. And so here, once again, we started with the head. And it's always a great starting point. You can start with any part that you wish, but starting with the head is great. We then defined the line of action. And then we defined our horizontal tilts, our horizontal axes. Generally building them on the action line, and we've put on the head there as well, helps us to get that angle. So here are the shoulders and the pelvis. And then we've started to use our directional shapes and opposing curves theory on that, opposing the curves of each side, to get our 2D directional flow gestures in, our dynamic shape gestures. All right. And the curves oppose each other. You can see here how they oppose throughout the form. And that effectively is 2D dynamic shape gestures, right? Dynamic shape gestures, once again, it's not anatomy. We're not trying to draw the anatomy. We definitely want to get proportions as close as we can, but we want to grab the energy, the flow of energy. If you could imagine energy flowing through the form, that's what we want to grab. And we want to get efficient at doing this, and we want to be able to do it very quickly. And I would say, certainly while this lesson has been long for the purpose of teaching, that you want to try and get this done in 60 seconds. And I'm not even kidding. Get it done in 60 seconds. Head. Okay, where's the head? Line of action. Boom. Pop the line of action. Okay, awesome. Where the horizontal tilts? Okay, boom, boom, boom. Done. Okay, we're in like 20 seconds. Yeah. Okay, cool. And directional shape for the chest. Directional shape for the stomach. Directional shape for the pelvis. And then boom, just popping those shapes in. Because these shapes, they really don't take long to draw that type of shape or that type of shape. Right? And be loose, be messy. I encourage you, please don't spend time on this. Be very quick, make it messy. Just make sure that when you're done, the gesture reads very similarly to the original. You go, okay, yes, I could probably replicate the pose of my drawing. All right, those are dynamic shape gestures. Let's move on to the next lesson. In this lesson, we're now going to take a look at drawing dynamic form gestures. And very much like drawing dynamic shape gestures, we want to use all the theory we've learned so far that's going to help us draw these gestures out effectively. Now, let me just say before we begin, if you are feeling like, hey, I need more practice with dynamic forms, then what you could definitely do is draw a dynamic shape gesture first, and then use that shape gesture as a guide to draw the form on top. If you feel you grasp dynamic forms, let's just jump straight into the dynamic forms. All right, let's get right into it. So just like usual, we're going to start with a head shape. I'm going to use a form head shape here, get a center line down there, draw in the form of the face. Just a basic form there. Try and keep my proportions relatively fine. And then I want to get my line of action in as close to possible as the original. All right, I feel like I'm not exaggerating that line of action enough. So I'm going to just kind of curve it a little bit more. Here we go. And then I can get my tilt lines in, my horizontal tilts, just to guide me as I draw out the form. Okay, those are a little bit parallel, almost. And then the pelvis is around here. All right. And now that I have those in, I can then start drawing in dynamic forms to try and mimic the forms that I'm seeing. I think in this instance, I'm going to start with the chest, have the line of action guide me as I'm drawing in the form here. Just checking my width there. Maybe it's more like this. I'm just drawing in some basic forms, getting in those basic forms. Just going to draw a sphere for the stomach area. And the pelvic line, well, the ilium crest is around here, so I'm going to draw that there. Look at that. And then I'm going to draw the forms for the legs in, which are really our dynamic tubes, and I'm drawing through there to really feel it. And as for the feet, I'm just going to use a basic form here for that. Nothing too crazy. Draw in this front leg in a form-based sense. And let's do the arms here. This one seems to be moving at that kind of angle. And here, once again, we're not wanting to replicate the anatomy perfectly, right? We'll get to anatomical gestures where that's really our goal, is we want to try and get the anatomy as close as possible. Here, what we're really striving to do again is get that dynamism, but get it in a forms sense. So we want to feel the dynamism in a form sense, start learning to draw the figure and see the forms of the figure, right? With the dynamism moving through them. So using that shape theory to get that dynamism in there and moving through there. Okay, I'm just going to weight this line up just so we can see that the head is in front. And that's relatively okay. I don't like this curvature happening over here. I think because I had redrawn it a little bit, I want this form to kind of read more in that sense. So we get that nice replicating crunch there, stretch here, stretch here. All right. And that is effectively drawing the form-based gesture from reference. And you can see that it is rough. You can see that it is loose. It's messy. It's not beautiful. And again, I want to reiterate, that is the point, right? We will get to beautiful. We will get there. And I just want to, I want to stick on this point and say, I see it so often with my students struggling to draw gestures because they have that fear in them of like, this doesn't look good and it's a bad representation of me and it's making me look bad because it looks terrible. That's not the point. We're learning. So please be rough, be loose. It must look fairly loose, fairly rough. And this is going to help you be quick. It's going to help you be rough and loose. There is a time for neatness and professionalism, and there is a time for being rough and loose. And once again, I use the construction site analogy or someone baking a cake in the kitchen. Those things do not happen neatly. You do not build a building neatly, right? So think about that, and I hope that's encouraging to you, and let's move on to the next lesson. The entire point of gesture drawing really is to teach us how to grab life. Grab that feeling of life, that energy of life, and then instill it in our own imaginatively drawn characters. We've now learned dynamic shape gestures. We've learned dynamic form gestures. We have an idea of how we can go about doing those. We're going to engage in exercises on them in our assignments. But now we want to move on to doing anatomical gestures. The important thing to remember when we do this, though, is that we're not trying to do a photocopy of the gesture. We're trying to take the anatomical gesture, take some of the nuance and the hints of the anatomy, and let that help our anatomical study as well. But really create an image that really portrays and communicates effectively the gesture that we're seeing, and maybe even more effectively if we can dramatize it a little bit, right? So we're not going for a photocopy of the gesture, right? We're not just drawing an observational life drawing of our life models or our gesture photos, all right? The second thing is that we want to work in a rough and refined stage. Rough, because if we start refined, we're going to take long, we're going to draw slowly, it's going to just end up being horrible and stiff. And that's why we want to do the roughs. And then the refined to really just enhance what we've done in the rough and just clean things up a little bit. And there we can take some time and make things look a little bit more professional. So I'm going to start here on a rough layer that I have, and then I'll work on a refined afterwards. If you're on paper, you'll do your rough, and then you will just kind of erase it with a kneaded eraser, and then go into your refined drawing. So what I'm going to do here is kind of indicate the head, and I'm going to be very rough, very loose. I'm not trying to create a photocopy. It's very important. And I'm going to get that line of action in. And I'm going to push that line of action even a little bit more here. Get that angle a little bit more extreme. I'm going to use some general measurements, get that shoulder line in there. See that elbow line in a sense. Why not? They're aligned. It helps align things. And let's get that pelvic line in, something like this. Something like that. All right. Just helps to lay out elements. And actually, line of action, let's build a center line right near it as well. That can help us position things. And I'm going to get this form in and really have that dynamic feeling going through. And so I'm going to mix up, while I'm doing this, I'm going to mix up my shape and form. Dynamic form and dynamic shape gestures. Mix them up, and she has actually a very long stomach area. Now that I look at that. And keep things loose and keep things dynamic. Let's get those dynamic shapes in there. Draw a leg here. Just check that knee line is relatively right. Just trying to keep the proportions going smoothly here. And drawing in that front leg dynamic shape, dynamic form, and we'll get that foot in there very much like that. All right. And a key thing as well is just be very quick about it. Be quick. Draw quickly. If you draw slowly, you will fall into the trap of things starting to look stiff. And that is probably one of the worst things that could happen to your work, is that it is stiff and just lacks the dynamism, lacks that dynamic feel. And here I'm copying the shape of this contour here, just so that it looks a little bit more correct. But I want to keep dynamism as a forefront. So if that leg's doing that, this one is doing the opposite thing, the very opposite thing. All right. Coming in here, I'm going to make this more extreme. This crunch happening here, I'm going to make it a little bit more extreme. We can get that breast shape in a little bit there. And here I'm going to follow the kind of indication of the skin going over my sphere of my stomach, going down into that pelvis area. I want to keep things nice and dynamic. Let's get these arms. Clearly this lower arm is doing that, so it has that directionality to it. So the upper arm will be doing something like that. And I'm going to really push those angles more. And pushing them is really a lot of what it is about that we're doing here, right? We want to push things. We want drama and interest. Drama gives us that visual interest. All right. And this shape is something like that. And do you see how when we're pushing it, we get that feeling of life in just the simple drawing of it? I'm not going to over detail the hand here, just kind of copy the shape a little bit. That's okay. Get the general feeling going. Let's just see the angle of her head is very much something like this. Her eye line is something like that. Just get that general tilt of her head in. And then we're going to draw in her hair. It's not necessary. And get that neckline in. And really capture those forms. And so what I'm going to do and really capture that dynamism, sorry, that's what I mean to say, more of the dynamism. Okay, let's just get her little clavicle line in there, that little indentation that joins her collarbone. Help us calculate this other breast position, so more like here. And then the muscle actually goes up there, something like that. And we can draw in this, just this very basic shape here for the bra section. Keep the heights the same. And we'll put in the underwear as well. It's around here. Keeping in mind contouring that shape. All right, and now that I've done that, and I feel like I'm really getting those lines of action reading and getting the essence of the pose, I'm just going to lightly erase this. I'm not doing the refined sketch just yet. I'm just going to lighten that up. I'm going to come in here, and now I'm going to just kind of get the anatomy a little bit more dynamic, using the hints from the reference material just to place things. I'm not going to over detail her head there. Get the bend of the arms in. So for example, stuff I'll take is like here, I'm taking the elbow. And I'll borrow some of these angles from the hand. And notice how fast I'm being and how loose I'm being. Now I've said that this is curving that way, but I actually feel upon closer inspection, no, let me just think about this. It's curving that way. Yeah, this is actually curving more like that. So I just put my opposing curves in incorrectly there, no big deal. Just correct it. Alright, oops, that one is a bit parallel. Let's just correct it like that. And we do have a big mass coming out there, so that does make sense. And I'm going to just kind of follow my dramatized angles a little bit. Get that in there. I don't want to sacrifice the drama, right? And our kind of exaggeration of what's happening in the forms. Indicate that anatomy. Do some here. And so I'm using the reference more as a guide to help me grasp the gesture better, rather than using it as an image that I'm trying to replicate. And I think it's something that needs to be constantly reiterated, is we're not trying to do a photocopy or a exact drawing. We're trying to capture the essence of things, right? Trying to capture the essence of things. So I'm going to come up here and get that in. And you know you're successful when you say, hey, do I feel like there's life in what I'm doing? Do I feel like I can feel the flow happening, right? The opposing curves flow happening, the rhythms happening through the forms that I'm drawing. Being loose, right? Being very loose with your lines. And not being afraid to be a little bit rough. It's not the end of the world if something's a little bit rough. Let's get this in. Some quick lines here, just to get the basic shapes in there. And let's put in that shoulder muscle that's clearly being indicated at that section. All right, another muscle there, muscle line. And I'm going to indicate the navel as well. Put that in there and just feel out. Do I feel like I've pushed the pose enough? All right. Just want to have pushed it enough. I'm not trying to create a photocopy once again. All right. And we'll just make her head just a little bit bigger. at the back area. All right, and once that's done, can then just lower the opacity here or do an erasing, go to my refined layer, or simply could just draw it on top. And I'll come in now and just really get the lines that I want in as loosely and as freely as possible. And I'm not even really using the reference much when I do this. I'm just kind of making sure that as I look at these forms, I'm being loose and I'm being gestural and trying to just get that energy and not lose it and have the same energy in my arm constantly working, right? In my arm, in my wrist as I'm drawing. Getting that head shape in. And I do have an example for you, which I will show you shortly, of what it shouldn't look like, right? What these really shouldn't end up looking like. Just indicating some of these lines, grabbing that, just make that a little bit more accurate. Can put some line weights where I feel I need them as I do this. Usually I do line weighting at the end, even when I'm doing my artworks. I will just do all the lines that I need and then do the line weights at the end just to enhance the drawing. Keeping the flow, keeping things loose. And you don't have to stick exactly to your plan either. So if you have some deviations where you're thinking, hey, you know, this would be much more dramatic if I bent, say in this example, maybe I bent the leg a little bit more, it would add to the drama and enhance the gesture a little bit more, then I would say do it, right? Ultimately, you want a natural feeling piece, not over detailing the hands or the feet, something to keep in mind. So here we're using all that knowledge of the dynamic forms, the dynamic shapes, and also drawing loosely, having dynamic lines, right? Lines that have directionality. Using opposing curves theory there. And literally I was just going this curve, that curve, this curve, that curve. I wasn't overthinking the anatomy of it. Being loose with the lines. Put that line like that. And I'll enhance this overlap here with the darker line. Let's just have it taper a little bit more. Put in the navel. We can indicate some of these anatomical lines just for effect. So the rib cage over there, a little bit of a rib cage. And let's just finish off this basic hand shape here, just kind of indicating these details. And relatively speaking, this is something we want to end up with. Not too many crazy details, but definitely feeling the flow of the pose, having things loose, having things natural. And if we want to tidy it up a little bit more, we can come in and line weight things that are overlapping. But the key thing, and this is really what I want you to remember, is your goal is, how can I best capture the feeling of life? We're not interested really in recreating an exact copy of something. No, we want to steal all the best things from reality and use it in our imaginative pieces. And that's really what we're doing. That's really what we want to learn about and do here. All right, and that would be a completed anatomy gesture drawing where we're really grabbing things and pushing things and just trying to capture that gesture. Now, let me show you an example. I did an example of what this shouldn't look like, all right? It shouldn't look like something like this that is trying to be the exact representation of the gestural pose or the gestural reference that you're using, right? That is not what we're trying to do. Please don't do that. Please don't sit and manually copy the contours and the outlines and the shapes of things, right? That's not what we want to do. Anatomical gesture drawing is not anatomy drawing, right? That our goal is the gesture, it's the feeling, it's the life. So don't do this, right? Don't do this. Even there's a symbol on my cursor. Bad, let's not do this, right? We want to really capture the things we need, right? Capture the flow, capture the forms, get the looseness, exaggerate the pose a little bit, right? And learn how to actively take what we want from the gesture so that we can then implement it into our own work. Let's move on to the next lesson. In this final lesson of gesture, we're going to learn about drawing life gestures, drawing people around you as they move around you, live around you, and really striving to capture as quickly as possible the overall gesture or the overall pose of the person, the look of the person. And so this type of gesture drawing, while we definitely want to use all our theories, because it's so fast, it falls largely into the shape category. And we really want to try and grab those gestures very quickly, especially if you're at the sort of typical scene, you're at a coffee shop, you have your sketchbook out and you want to do some gestural drawing. Capturing someone who's walking past you is going to be quite a quick instance that you're going to see them, and you want to implement it very quickly. And so we're going to look at that and how we can approach that. I've got these 3 examples here, and I'm going to do 3 examples, one for each, to show how we can try to quickly capture the gesture with all the theory that we have, understanding the dynamism, looking at the world differently, looking at people differently, and looking at the dynamism in their forms and trying to grab those things very quickly and doing multiple drawings of this type. So let's get right into it. I'm going to start with Soccer Dude. 3, 2, 1, and go. Just trying to grab Soccer Dude's hair a little bit. You can see it's a very sketchy kind of way of drawing. I'm just trying to get all of these elements in. I'm not trying to go too crazy and get some crazy details in. I'm imagining the directional flow here in his back legs. Get that foot shape in there maybe. It's very sketchy, very messy, very loose. Trying to get it in and really just kind of capture, right? Capture this form as fast as humanly possible. Right, and now I'm just looking a little bit more in detail. Right, pressing a little harder, getting those shapes down. Kind of indicating his head a little bit, and I kind of want to end soon, right? I want to kind of end soon because I don't have all the time in the world to capture this. And boom, there pretty much we've got the bulk of his gesture in, right? Let's just get his leg a bit better there. And that's really what we're talking about when it comes to life gesture. And here I've even included the soccer ball and trying to get the general shapes of his clothing in, right? So I'm not drawing just his anatomy, I'm just getting the general shapes of everything about him. So it appears that he is some kind of soccer player. And the temptation will always be, when you're doing this kind of drawing, to spend more time than necessary on it. My advice to you would be, grab a couple of gestures, sit down in the coffee shop or wherever, go to a park or wherever, look at the people, get down, let's say 5-10 gestures, and then afterwards, use your creativity, lighten them up, erase them, and just add in your own details, right? And just clean them up a little bit if you want to have slightly nicer looking gestural works there. But the real goal is for us to look at an image or look at a person and capture their pose and the feeling of their pose as fast as possible using what we know. Let's do number 2, which is the girl with the pink hair. Okay, and here I go. I'm going to get her face in there quickly, get her neck in, trying to just get that attitude of her pose. A lot of it's coming from that shoulder line. Her one arm's coming down, other arm's on her hip. And I'm kind of simplifying, really simplifying a lot of these angles. Get that flow in her leg. She's got a heel on. Just kind of get it in there really quickly. The other leg's taking the weight. Directional shapes. It's kind of more straight because it's taking the weight. And that shoe's kind of tilted a little bit. I can show that just to enhance that. Boom, and she's got a camera in her hand. I'm just going to draw a box and her hands here. I'm not even going to bother with the details. Maybe put her jean line in, put her v-neck in, the big shapes, right, and get her ponytail in a little bit. And that's kind of where I'd probably tell myself, hey, stop drawing, you've got the bulk of the gesture in there, right? The idea is as well, again, I love using this example, is, could somebody looking at this replicate the pose? Even though it's as rough and loose as it is, could they replicate the pose? And if they can, you've probably done a good job, right? You've captured the essence of really what that character is doing. Okay, it's not about the details, and that's what I want to say as well. It really isn't about the details. You want to be able to very quickly capture human form, and the more you do this, the less lines you use, and probably more neater it's going to look. It's going to look way more neater than mine are. I have not done this in a long time, although I advise you, especially if you're a beginner, do it as much as possible. And it's fun. It really is fun. Eventually you have the sketchbook with like millions of gestures in it. Have a couple of those, and yeah, it's really nice to show people. Look at all these people that I've captured, all these little miniature people. Okay, let's do number 3, and we're going to start with our head. Head's always a good starting point. I'm just going to get that in there. Maybe I can try and capture the gesture of her hair falling in a sense, and I'm kind of just making up a lot of these shapes and curves. I just want to get the flow. It's quite an iconic piece of this image. All right, good, that's in there, and let's get that shoulder line in, down. Just be loose, just be rough in the beginning. Get that arm in, boom, that's in. Other arms coming down at an angle. Right, something like that. Her hands are together in some sense. Dress is got quite a strange shape, and I want to grab that shape, just simplify it. Knee over here, coming down. Front leg, back leg coming down, its knees over here. Dress kind of flows there, up, that type of shape, and coming down here. Now I'm thinking directional flow. It's coming up, so this one's kind of going to be doing this, even though the muscle is showing, the actual directional flow of the leg is doing that. Okay, and that leg's tucking behind, foot behind there, and this foot's kind of probably leaning down, something like that. And she's on this, just to make it clear to the viewer, she's on some kind of railing, and we can just add the dress in and hint at some other anatomical forms. Let's add her neckline in, quite a big shape there of the dress. And boom, that one's done. All right. And as you progressively do this more and more, you'll get better. And it's really easy, and the goal is fast. So that is effectively drawing life gestures. Go to a coffee shop. It's greatest excuse to get a cappuccino. Sit down and really pump these out. Pump these out like crazy, and you'll learn so much about people, about personalities, about clothing styles, about hairstyles, about posture, about gesture, right? And gesture really is wonderful. It's really the core of character drawing. That is the end of this lesson. Go for it. I'm so excited to see what you guys submit, and I will catch you in the final lesson of this module, which we are covering how to do your gesture exercises. So I'll see you guys there. In this video, we're going to take a look at how to approach your gesture drawing assignments. We have 2 windows open here, an image viewer on the left and Photoshop on the right, as well as the gesture studies template that comes in module 4. And this is great for Photoshop. You can't really print this out, so this isn't really a guide to doing it traditionally. If you're doing it traditionally, I would say to do about 4 gestures per page instead of 20 per sheet. Once you've got this template in Photoshop, you can just zoom in and add a new layer on top. It's a very high resolution file, so you can zoom in quite close and do really nice resolution gestures. Not that they need to be high resolution, but so that it's a very practical use for when you're doing your gestures. And then you simply browse your image library on the left and then draw in the gestures on the right, obviously based on the timing requirements of that assignment, whether it's 60-second gestures, 120-second gestures, and so forth. And that essentially is how you should approach doing your gesture studies, doing 20 of them, 1 in each of the blocks, based on the assignment requirements. That's the end of this lesson.